There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean of Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. I have had kind of a crappy week, and I'm not going to dwell on it. It's nothing too serious, at least I don't think it is. But I have had a chronic cough for many years, and then suddenly in the last month or so it's gotten twice as bad as it's ever been, to the point where it's driving me to distraction, or certainly distracting me from doing things like read a book. It's hard to read a book when I collapse into a coughing fit 3 times a minute, and it has often been like that. That's all I'm going to say about it. I'm getting medical tests and trying every which kind of medicine and treatments and stuff, and I have to say it got a little bit better afternoon and evening yesterday. So I'm hoping that means is it some seasonal thing, an allergy? Who the hell knows? But it has virtually disabled me. I've had to cancel social appointments and this and that because I can't go out to a restaurant coughing like this. And it takes twice as long to edit my videos because I have to edit out all the coughs, and oh my god. Anyway, enough whining. I'll figure it out eventually, or it'll go away eventually, or something. But it has been all I've done since I last talked to you. I have done some reading, and it was very difficult to get that reading done because I have to keep putting. I'll leave that one cough in. I won't edit that out, and that is a very mild cough compared to how some of them can go. But when you have to put the book down every 30 seconds to cough, and then pick it back up and try to find your place again, and then, so that's the kind of week it's been. Other than that, life is beautiful. There's a really positive vibe in the air politically in certain parts of the world, and still lots of negative news. I'm not going to comment on any of that. That's not what you're here for. So instead, I'm excited to introduce you to this week's mystery guest. And today's mystery guest is the Canadian author, Marion Agnew, joining us from near Thunder Bay, Ontario, a town called Sinha. Marion, how lovely to have you on my Friday Reads.
Oh, it's great to be here, Sean. Thanks for your interest.
Oh, well, I'm just delighted. I can't even remember how I heard about your novel. I think it might have been on Instagram. It was before I started following you there, but somebody mentioned it. And then I got the library copy, and then I'm such a slow reader that I had to take it back. So I got my own copy of Making Up the Gods, and I'm still luxuriating in it. Only 100 pages or less into it, and absolutely enjoying it, and that's why I've invited you. So Making Up the Gods was published, was it last year or early this year?
Just coming up on a year, last
Yeah.
October.
And who is the publisher? Latitude
46 out of Sudbury, the one that specializes in stories of Northern Ontario.
Yeah, so for people that aren't familiar with Thunder Bay, it's way up north. How many hours north of Toronto are you?
It's not even so much north as it is west. Like, we're way closer to Winnipeg. So it's an 8-hour drive to Winnipeg, a 6-hour drive to Minneapolis.
So, Marion, tell us about Making Up the Gods. Editing Sean here. I forgot to mention during the recorded part of my lovely chat with Marion that this novel is available in the States and in the UK through famous online booksellers, some of which are not politically correct to mention anymore.
Well, it is a contemporary novel, so set today, and it features 3 main characters. The first is Simone, who is a 69-year-old widow who's estranged from her living family and feeling slightly disconnected, and maybe would like to be more connected to the community, but doesn't really know how to do that. The second character is a young boy named Chen, who is 9 years old, and there was a traffic accident in Thunder Bay approximately 3 months before the story starts. And Chen lost his father and his stepbrother in this accident. And the third character is Martin, who is a kind of middle-aged 50s somethings, not necessarily a drifter, but not a fine, upstanding young man, from Southern Ontario. And one day he appears at Simone's door and says that he is her cousin. And then she is faced with, what do I really want? Do I want family? Do I not want family? And it's about the same time that a couple of her friends have kind of guilted her into taking care of Chen, this young boy, for a long weekend. So that's way out of her comfort zone.
And she initially says no.
That's right.
And
Because
then,
that's what you say is, if in doubt, say no.
so Martin, this cousin, when you're introduced to him, you realize there's reasons to be suspicious about him being who he says he was. I could say more. Marion could say more, but we're not going to say more because it's a delight to experience how he's revealed to us in the opening chapters. And I heard you on another podcast talk about how you were kind of surprised that you had written a novel that was very much about grieving in various of these characters' lives, that wasn't what you set out to write, but that it is one of the central themes. Tell us more about that.
Well, this is one of those times when I don't know if creative writing is woo-woo, if it's my therapy. I don't understand necessarily how that works, and that's probably a good thing. But I'm always been interested in how grown-ups make choices, because I thought, you go through these stages. You're a toddler, then you're a tween, and then there's a teen, and you're an adolescent, and you graduate and you become an adult at 21. And then the next thing that happens is you retire. Maybe you have kids, maybe you get married, but there's no other words for what happens in between. And they kind of invented the concept of a midlife crisis. I mean, the label, obviously, it had happened before, but the label of midlife crisis came along when I was, I guess, in my 20s. So I'd heard of that one. And then they invented quarter life crisis. So there's another label, but there's this big, long time frame where you're just doing stuff. Like you go to work, and then how do you know how to keep growing? And it's been this structured life for me, it was for a long time. And then there's all this life in front of you, and how do you do that? So I actually had several people that I knew who were in their 30s, probably 30s and 40s, maybe, who they would go back to school, enter an MFA program. One of the women I knew was actually 50 when she did it, which seemed so ancient to me, which is like in the rearview mirror now. But there was another friend who got an offer of a scholarship to work on a PhD program and chose not to go. And I'm just like, how did you decide? I mean, it was this opportunity landed in your lap. How do you do that? And so, I mean, making choices as a grown-up, I didn't really connect the fact that often pain is the reason that you make a change in your life. I mean, often you might say, oh, I've always wanted to do this, but it's because what's going on with you isn't working. And I hadn't really put that together. My mom died when I was 39, it's not unusual, but none of my friends had parents. A lot of their grandparents were still living. And so for me, it felt very much like I was a special snowflake, and I had all this stuff. And so I knew that I responded to grief, and I just assumed that kind of everybody did. So that part of it wasn't that interesting, and that I was really interested in the decision-making part. I think one thing I didn't mention about Martin is that he's an alcoholic in recovery. And as with any other change or a commitment, that's not something that you do once and then you're done. It's a daily. You wake up and don't drink that day. And, you wake up and stay married that day. Or in Simone's case, well, yeah, she wants to maybe have more friends and not die all by herself. But how does she do that? Well, she goes to lunch with someone and then doesn't tell them everything that she probably could tell them, and isn't really honest with them or herself, and says no in case she does something stupid or gets uncomfortable. So those are all choices too. And so that's how I saw it. But of course, it's in response to grief.
Well, it sure is hitting all the right notes for me thus far. Tell us about the title, unless it's a spoiler to talk about what the title means.
It's not a spoiler. Making Up the Gods is one of the first parts of the very first conversation that Simone and Chen have when she does end up taking care of him for a long weekend. She doesn't know what else to do with the kid, so they go down to the lake and they're standing in the water, even though it's May, and so the lake water is freezing. And they're just having a conversation. He's Indigenous, and so he's interested in Indigenous traditions and has been reading up on gods, because when your dad and stepbrother die in an accident, you kind of wonder, why do bad things happen? And he's learned about trickster gods, and he says, if I were the one making up the gods, I wouldn't have any that did bad things. I just have nice gods. And that's something that I didn't mean it as necessarily a Christian commentary. I look at the characters in this book as being kind of culturally Christian, that Simone grew up maybe going to church. She's heard of a lot of Bible stories. She's not necessarily, she goes to church, but she's not evangelical in any way. But it's part of the fabric of the community. And that's what I thought Chen might be referring to. And then it also works as a metaphor for the stories that we tell ourselves. Like, to whom do we give power? Who has power over our lives? We have these stories that we tell ourselves, oh, I'm no good at parties, or I'm terrible at volleyball, or I can't draw. Those things that we tell ourselves.
You're describing my character to a T so far.
Well, I get a lot of it looking in the mirror, I will tell you. But it's we tell ourselves these things, and that's fine. I mean, sometimes it's nice to know I'm never going to be an accountant. Sometimes that kind of knowledge is really helpful. And sometimes it really, well, what if you took a drawing class? Would that be so terrible? And if you weren't ever in control of what you produced while you were drawing, would that be so bad? So sometimes they limit us, and it's sometimes a good thing, and sometimes it's not so good. So, but just that whole process of thinking through how we make choices.
And I want to also add that so far this novel has a real sense of humor about it too. So the reader should expect to be smiling and chuckling as well at various points in the novel. It's got, I would say, in particular, Simone is a real character, and some of her observations on life and the world are maybe gallows humor in places, but certainly, it's entertaining in that level as well.
I'm glad to hear it. I don't get a lot of responses saying, "Oh, I laughed out loud." But
Well, I
thought it
wouldn't
was
say laugh out
funny.
loud, and I don't particularly enjoy that kind of fiction, but it certainly has various tonalities, various tones. And this is your second book. Tell us about your first book, which was a nonfiction type of book.
It was. It was a collection of personal essays. That's kind of the nonfiction equivalent of a short story collection. The personal essays, about half of them were published in literary journals like Prairie Fire, Malahat Review, some online places as well. And most of them dealt with my mother's dementia, which is why the title of the book is Reverberations, A Daughter's Meditations on Alzheimer's. My mom was 43 when I was born, and so I experienced parental loss younger than my contemporaries. And so I really didn't know how to handle it. And then my family also, we were really invested in mom not being sick. Like we didn't want to acknowledge it, and she didn't want to acknowledge it, that she was having trouble remembering things. It felt particularly sad because she'd always done really well in school. She was born in Port Arthur, which is now part of Thunder Bay, which is where I live. She left this region to go to undergraduate school at Queen's and then to graduate school at Harvard, and was a mathematician and mathematics professor, worked on nuclear weapons technology during the war, had always been really identified as with her intellect. And so for her to be losing cognitive abilities was particularly sad for us. And I think that's true for everyone. It's a disease that can cause changes that change the person that you thought you knew. So anyway, all those reasons are why I was drawn to write about it for myself. I needed to write down what I was seeing, because I kind of couldn't believe it. And so if I wrote it down, it made it real. And it also kept me from being able to leave. I lived in Colorado. My parents lived in Oklahoma. And so I could go visit, tell dad he was doing everything wrong, be an angel for my mother, get frustrated, cry, not in general, not handle it very well. And then I could go home. And it was really tempting once you leave a situation like that to think, oh, it wasn't that bad. Oh, I'm sure they're fine. And I didn't want to be able to do that either. So I wrote a lot during the time that she was ill. And then finding creative nonfiction and the Creative Nonfiction Collective in Canada. And when I had moved here, that was the first group that I connected with, made for a really exciting and interesting time working with material that I knew well and finding new ways to communicate what I wanted the emotional realities to communicate. So I'm proud of the book. It's not an easy book to read. It's not, if someone has dementia, you give them a book, it's supposed to be, positive ways to cope or finding hope in difficult times. And this is not that book. It is a book that I kind of played with the idea of sound as I went through the essays. So they tend to refer to sound. And it's very honest, which can be uncomfortable.
Sounds really powerful. I'm curious as to why you chose the form rather than a quote unquote straightforward memoir, that it was in the essay format.
It's tough, partly because I think those lines between what's a memoir and what's an essay are pretty fluid in the middle. And it's also the story a little bit about my mother, because it's not about, I know my life wasn't particularly interesting. I'm, just a university professor kid who grew up in the middle of the United States. And so I'm not, I'm the tail end of the baby boom. I mean, there's a bunch of people like me out in the world, but it's our relationship changing that was the part of the story that was the most interesting to me. Things like how is rowing like loss, which is also actually something I talk about in my novel a little bit too. But it's because everything is backwards, opposite, and contrary. Or the hours of daylight. My mom worked on projects that had to do with determining how many hours of daylight there were. And that's an interesting metaphor for cognitive and awareness and abilities and the changes in those, the twilight, the shades of twilight. So it made for interesting metaphors. The personal essay lends itself to short, I find.
Yeah.
So a collection of shorter pieces instead of a long arcing novel, or even, three, like Cheryl Strayed's Wild is one that has, she's walking the Pacific Coast Trail and she's talking about her mom. And so they're married together. And that's not how I had written these. So I was really grateful that Signature Editions in Winnipeg was willing to publish it as they were essays.
Sounds fascinating. And you've got some other writing irons in the fire, if I can put it that way. Tell us what you're working on now, or
Sure. I've got a novel draft. Unfortunately, it's still a little bit in search of a plot. I mean, I know what I want the plot to be, but it's not exciting. So I'm trying to figure out how to make my characters interact with the plot in a way that makes the plot make sense. Anyway, it's a novel. It's called Island Cartography, its working title, because it's about islands and it's about maps. I don't know who said it first, but I read it in one of those emails that you get on the mailing list of somebody for. And I think it's Seth Godin said it. We draw maps to leave things out.
oh,
Which I thought was pretty interesting. And, there's lots of thinking about islands that we look like islands, but we're connected underneath. And it's about land. And how do we own the land? And are we owned by land? And what is our responsibility to the land? Which is something that I think about a lot in Canada. I just in relation, we're in Robinson Superior Treaty territory here. So it was signed in 1850. But but really what was signed and who's living up to what parts of that and what does all of that mean? So those are the big questions I'm tackling.
Big questions indeed. Well, if I wasn't such a polite Canadian, I'd say, hurry up, I want to read it.
Well, thank you. I would like
That
to read
sounds
it
good.
too.
Yes. And let's shift to talking about Marion Agnew, the reader. What have you been reading recently that you'd like to recommend?
So I like to talk about Canadian books, although I read a lot of UK authors and I also read a lot of American authors. And I go back and forth reading fiction and nonfiction, but I wanted to talk about two or three books today that are fiction. And the first is If Sylvie Had Nine Lives by Leona Theis.
Oh,
This came out from Freehand, and it came out in 2021. Pandemic. It was a pandemic release. Might have come out in 2020. But anyway, it was a pandemic release, did not get as much attention as I feel it should. And it basically takes a woman's life at an inflection point, a marriage, and then teases out what might happen if she had made different choices along the way. So she might get married, she might not get married. I don't always like Sylvie. I find her difficult sometimes. I find in some of her lives that she chose, she's happier, and in others, she's really kind of unpleasant. But they're all true to who she is. And I can't even, by the end of the book, I can't even really be sure which one I really wished were the real story that was hers, if that makes sense. And it's beautifully written too. She's a poet also, and I believe from Saskatchewan. So
well, I'm gonna have to give back my Saskatchewan passport. I've never heard of her.
yeah, it's just one that I can't let go of. It's a little bit like, I mean, it's easy to say, oh, it's that Gwyneth Paltrow movie. Was it Sliding Doors, where time she makes the train and one time she misses the train, and then those two timelines. But it's much more thoughtful and in depth than that. And in a similar vein, this is called Asking for a Friend. It's by Clare. Clare actually needs no help from me when it comes to publicizing herself. She works for 49th Shelf. She is well known in the community. She lives in Toronto. This is her fourth or fifth book. And it's not for everyone, I'm guessing, but I found it interesting because it talks about friendship in a way that I don't often see friendship discussed. It's about two young women who meet at university, and they go through a lot of the things that women go through in university together. And it's about how when we make different choices from our friends, that can threaten our own sense of identity. And so when I was reading it, I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And then I put it down, and then I kept coming back to it, partly because I'm writing about women, sisters, friends, those relationships. And I don't think they're often as truthfully portrayed as they are in Kerry's book. And also there's a sense of that I don't really know. She talks about things I don't understand because I'm not a mother. I didn't go through the pregnancy. I didn't, there's a lot of choices around motherhood that people feel very strongly about. And if you're not doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. And I found it really interesting, encapsulated those discussions around my approach to motherhood versus your approach to motherhood. So I found that really interesting. And again, that came out, gosh, almost 2 years ago now. I picked it up because I know Kerry. She does a lot for Canadian authors, and so I like to read her books. But this one has just stayed with me in a way that I didn't expect.
Well, two for two, books and writers I've never heard of. So let's see if it's going to be three for three.
It's
Oh,
not, because this is Fire Exit by Morgan Talty, which I found, I mean, my local bookstore had it, and it was one of the books that's sitting on the table. And then I saw that you had talked about it,
yeah,
and I thought, this sounds pretty interesting. And I'm so glad to have read it. It's a book about big ideas, but they're very understated ideas.
absolutely.
Relations, family, blood. What does blood even mean? Like, whose laws are those? It's set in the States, but there's equal questions, here, like whose who is allowed to do some things, who is allowed to write about things, whose stories are we telling. And I found it really interesting. And the main character is kind of opaque in some ways because
That's a good word.
he's so single-minded about wanting his daughter to know who he is to her. That and his need for people to know the truth. Like, I don't know that I've seen a main character that opaque since I read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel long ago.
Oh, interesting comparison.
Because I mean, Thomas Cromwell is very, of course, supposedly evil, but I never got the sense from him that he was evil. He was self-preservation and calculating as a way to stay safe. I got that part from it. But in some ways, he's also, there's almost like a pane of glass between you and him. And I felt a little bit that same way with Morgan Talty's narrator as well.
Well, that's really beautifully described. I found him to be so empty of character in so many interesting ways. And I'm a reader. I'm a character-driven reader, and I found the absence of character in him absolutely compelling. So, yeah, I'm glad.
Yeah, he's one that it's like he's best defined in relationship to other people. You don't, I mean, he says things, so it's as if you know what he's thinking, but really he's most alive when dealing with his mother or his friend, or even almost creepily stalking his own family or his own daughter. Like it's just so interesting. And is he part of the community? Is he not part of the community? So many questions.
Yeah, it was a really, really strong novel, and I heartily recommend that you, when the time is right for you, to pick up his debut short story collection, which came out maybe a year and a half ago, Night of the Living Reds, which,
Okay.
if I had to say it, I enjoyed it even more, but I
Oh,
love both of them. Yeah. Linked short
yeah.
stories set on the same Penobscot reservation. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I like linked stories.
Well, wonderful. So I'm going to eventually finish Making Up the Gods, and it's one of those books where I don't really want it to ever end, so it might be a few months down the road, but I'm going to have Marion come back and do a deep dive kind of chat about the novel then. Thanks so much for this really stimulating chat, Marion.
Thank you, Sean. I really appreciate it.
Marion Agnew, I am really enjoying her novel. Like I said there, I'm reading it incredibly slowly. Once I eventually finish, maybe next year, I will have her back to talk about it, but it is a really great novel for me so far. All right, so because of my coughing and because I really needed to prioritize reading, I didn't put up any videos this week since my last Friday reads. I'm working on one author chat video that's long and should get it posted in the next few days, but nothing at all this week. Patreon news. We have set the schedule for the discussion of Margaret Laurence's novel, The Stone Angel, and that's going to be on September 28th. I'm excited to reread The Stone Angel myself, and I'm about to announce on Patreon, so this is a little bit of a scoop, my second book giveaway of the year for my patrons, and this just came in the mail today for that purpose, and this is Christopher DiRaddo's Canadian queer novel, The Family Way, which I recently finished and absolutely loved. I have a full-length chat with Christopher DiRaddo. That's the video I'm working on editing that'll be coming to my channel soon. You have to be a member of my Patreon to enter, and this will be listed today, and it'll be open for people to express an interest in for the next 7 to 10 days, something like that. All right, I have finished 2 books, and that was quite an achievement with all this coughing. And I didn't love either one of them. I liked them to the point that I'm glad I read them, but I have more negative things than positive to say about them. Which is, unless it's a 5-star read, that's always the case. The first is The Colony by Audrey Magee. I liked it. I didn't love it. I didn't think it was that great. So 4-star read, that's what a 4-star read is for me. It was worth my time, but that I have more criticisms than praise to give it. This was a pseudo-buddy read as a Patreon benefit to my upper-tier patron and one of my most supportive subscribers, Alina, over in Rotterdam, and I recorded our chat about it. It took a go up on this channel sometime somewhat soon. So stay tuned for that. But I will say a little bit about it here. Alina liked it better than I did. We both didn't think it was a perfect novel. And I think she kind of talked me into liking it a little bit more. But it still was not a 5-star read. I thought the writing was wonderful. It was a much talked about novel. And on the Booker long list, was it last year or something? So you probably know about it. But it's set on an Irish island in 1979. And there's an English artist who goes out there to paint. And there's a French linguist who goes out there every summer because he's trying to save the Irish language. And he and the English guy don't get along, and there is a small population of native Irish people on the island, and it's the story of what happens that summer. The political, cultural stuff didn't really work for me. I thought it was not fully integrated into the fictional narrative in a way that was satisfying for me, but I still enjoyed learning about the Irish history and the history of the Irish language. Actually, I did appreciate it. I just thought it wasn't particularly artfully done. I'll leave my comments there. The writing was beautiful. I didn't think all of the characters jumped off the page. I'm glad I read it, but it's certainly nowhere near the best Irish novel I've read, that's for sure. And I also finally finished the Rose Tremain novel from 1999, Music and Silence, set in the early 17th century. And maybe I would call this a work of historical fiction because it wasn't that good. So I will damn it with that literary term, which I loathe. It was actually quite literary in many ways. Again, really well told. The writing was lovely. But I just didn't end up caring about very much that happened in this novel. Danish king, Christian IV, and I soon realized that she didn't hew very closely at all to history. I didn't know anything about King Christian IV, but everything I found online was, she didn't really care about any historical accuracy. So that part was not first and foremost in my mind as I was reading. I read this for I'll Have a Cheer Reading, which is kind of a memorial read-along event that I was very vaguely, very tangentially co-sponsoring with Chris and Emily of the Book Cougars in memory of Jenny Colvin, whose podcast, Reading Envy, was an important part of the bookish social media universe for many a year until her untimely death a couple years ago, and I was a guest several times, 3 times I think, and knew her, as did Chris and Emily, know her quite well. And so the idea behind I'll Have What You're Reading, which was the slogan for Jenny's podcast, was to pick something off Jenny's Goodreads and read it. So I picked this off of her TBR. I am interested in Rose Tremain, and I didn't like this novel. I gave it 3 stars. It really annoyed me how many characters she had, and every character, then every time they appeared, they brought a backstory and at least 3 other characters that I had to get invested in and often didn't get invested in. And so that just bugged me by the end because I didn't see what the point of it all was. Yes, there was a lot about music. It was too long. And, well, there were some things I enjoyed about it. I thought it was really sexist because it was about half the story was told in the idiom of a fairy tale. Fairy tales are shit. So a lot of this was, my God, the sexism, whore Madonnas, the perverted sex that so many of these women characters. I'm not judging it. Far be it from me to judge sexual perversion, is what I'm trying to say. But giving a character sexual quirks does not equal good layered characterization. No, this was just really a massive flop. But I compare anything that's set back in history to Hilary Mantel, who writes literary novels that happen to be set back in history. This was an incredibly inferior attempt that I wouldn't particularly recommend. Do I make myself clear? I taped a chat with Chris and Emily on the Book Cougars that's going to be coming in their next episode about my experience of this book, but I didn't rant quite as much. I was saving that for you all here. It doesn't turn me off of Rose Tremain, because I loved the Gustav Sonata, and I have lots of her most of the stuff she writes I think is contemporary, not set back in history, and I will avoid the stuff that's set back in history for fear of encountering more fairy tale bullshit. But I'm looking forward to reading more of Rose Tremain's contemporary fiction. There's just a couple more things to do here. One is to tell you my very early thoughts on Khwabnama, a novel by a Bangladeshi writer set in pre-partition Bengal by Akhteruzzaman Elias, translated from the Bengali by Arunava Sinha. And oh my god, I'm loving this. I've read the first 50 pages of 550. This is a buddy read with Joe Smith. And the story is opening. I'm actually not sure, but the timing in the 20th century is really slippery, but I know most of the story happens in the 1940s. Where it's opening, it could be a bit earlier than that, or quite a bit earlier than that, I'm not sure. But it has one of the most enigmatic openings of any novel I've ever read, which is when I read it for a book haul. I'll put a link to that reading, that book haul video. I just have been obsessed with tackling this ever since because it just was incredible. And so I have now read the first three or so chapters. It is very the opening is very magically realist, and that is something that I have struggled with a lot of the time, but I never seem to have a problem with it when it's set in a non-Western culture, and I certainly am loving that part of this story. Tour de force of magical realism in the opening chapter. It's related to a Bengali man who was shot by a British military asshole at the very beginning of the colonization of India, which it all would have been at that time. And then his spirit is watching over this area of Bengal where he was assassinated or where he was murdered. And there's so much shape-shifting and history and description of the social world of this small area of Bengal in that opening chapter. It's dizzying, it's mesmerizing. And then both Joe and I, when we checked in, we admitted that we thought, I hope the whole book isn't like this, because it's just too not only intense, but really detailed and requiring a lot of concentration to follow all the strands of it. And so sure enough, the next chapter is more realistic. I think it's in the 1940s, but I'm not sure of that yet. With the man who sleepwalks and keeps going to this tree on a body of water. Is it a lake or I forget what it is. To want to get a glimpse of this historical figure who keeps shape-shifting. But he himself in the next chapter and his family is more realistically drawn, but yet it's also really dense with characters and social political history of the poverty of all of these people and their backstories. It has grabbed me by the collar. I don't really have a collar today, but I do have a new blouse. Loving it so far. Going to keep Joe and I busy for several more weeks. And in preparation for another pseudo-buddy read that I think that Zoom chat is happening next weekend. So it's time for me to get busy with a reread of Barbara Pym's novel Less Than Angels. I have read all of her novels in chronological order, and I'm rereading this as a pseudo-buddy read with another upper-tier patron, Robin, as one of her benefits. And I think we're going to record, I think we've decided, maybe we haven't quite decided yet if we're going to record our chat next weekend and I'll put it up here or not, but we are going to chat about it. I remember that I did like Less Than Angels, and I think ultimately it was a 5-star read, as almost all of Barbara Pym's novels were. It was originally published in 1955, and this is her 4th novel, a tale of anthropologists and their loved ones in the 50s. Oh, and I wrote in my review at the time, it didn't grab me nearly as much as the first 3 novels, not at first, but at a certain point, and this is what I do remember, at a certain point, Pym set her character Catherine, a non-conforming romance novelist, aflame. I was suddenly gobsmacked, wondering just how far the blaze might carry us. So I remember that her character just kind of erupted at the end in a really powerful way. So with that in mind, I'm looking forward to rereading it. I found an audiobook that I think I'm going to risk spending $20 on because I didn't really take to the voice, but I keep getting burned with that, so I'm going to risk it. And if I really end up loving the audiobook, I probably will just listen and not read it so that I can do it while I'm exercising or cleaning the house, neither of which I do very often. But anyway, So that's what I'm starting in the coming week. That's my Friday Reads. And thank you very much for watching.